Elizabeth, remembered by history as Elizabeth Hay, Countess of Erroll, born Elizabeth FitzClarence, the royal daughter that England was never quite supposed to acknowledge, and yet could never entirely forget. She was born with royal blood in her veins and no crown to show for it, the daughter of a prince who would one day be king, raised in a warm and busy house that the world watched from a careful distance. Her mother was the most celebrated actress of the age, and her father was a man who loved deeply but was never entirely free. For the first 10 years of her life, Bushy House was full of laughter, and it seemed as though the unusual arrangement might simply go on forever. And then the world asked her father to choose, and he did. Her mother left and never came back. Elizabeth grew up, married into one of the oldest noble houses in Scotland, and lived quietly in the long shadow of a family story that was, by any measure, extraordinary. Tonight, we follow that journey from the very beginning. Good evening, and welcome back to Sleepy Crown Reborn. If you have only just subscribed, welcome to the family, and if you are returning to us once more, welcome back home. It is a pleasure, as always, to have you here. Tonight, we embark on a complete journey through one of the most quietly remarkable lives of the early 19th century, the life of Elizabeth FitzClarence, who was born a royal daughter, raised in one of England's most unconventional households, and who found her place in the world not through any throne or public glory, but through the quieter dignities of marriage, motherhood, and loyalty. Over the next several hours, we will move gently through her world, from the stage-lit romance of her parents to the warmth and eventual grief of Bushy House, through her marriage into the ancient Scottish earldom of Erroll, the years she spent as countess, mother, and widow, and finally the poignant last journey she made through Scotland in the winter of 1856. So make yourself comfortable, lower the lights, let the day gently slip away, and if you have a moment before you drift off, a gentle like and a quiet comment, perhaps telling us which part of Elizabeth's story stayed with you most, help keep these stories coming. Now, let us begin. Before we can speak of Elizabeth FitzClarence, we must first speak of the two people who made her possible, and who, between them, created one of the most quietly scandalous and strangely tender love stories that Regency England ever produced. The first of these two people was a woman named Dorothea Bland. She was born on the 22nd of November 1761, near the city of Waterford, on the southern coast of Ireland, the third of 6 children born to Francis Bland, a man who worked in the theatre as a stagehand, and his mistress, Grace Phillips, who was herself an actress. It was not a wealthy household, and it was not an entirely stable one, but it was a household that lived and breathed the world of performance. Dorothea grew up surrounded by the rhythms of the theatre, its rehearsals and its rivalries, its late nights and its strange, flickering glamour. Her father, Francis Bland, abandoned the family when Dorothea was still a young girl. He had sent money from time to time, enough to keep things from collapsing entirely, but not enough to keep the household comfortable. Her mother, Grace Phillips, was left to manage as best she could, and she made the decision that would shape the entire course of her daughter's life. She recognized that Dorothea had talent, genuine and unmistakable talent, and she put her on the stage to help the family survive. Dorothea was 13 years old the first time she performed in public, and even then, the audiences noticed her. She was quick to learn lines, naturally graceful in movement, and possessed of a warmth and a comic instinct that drew laughter from the pit and approval from the galleries. She had what the theatre calls presence, the quality that makes an audience lean forward slightly without quite knowing why. In the years that followed, as she moved from Dublin to the theatres of northern England, through the touring companies that traversed the provinces, her reputation grew steadily and then rapidly. Audiences across Yorkshire and Lancashire were coming specifically to see her. Critics were beginning to reach for superlatives. And then, in 1785, she came to London. The Royal Theatre at Drury Lane was, in that era, the most famous stage in England. It was the place where careers were made or ended, where the best and most celebrated performers of the age displayed their gifts before the sharpest and most exacting audiences in the country. For Dorothea to arrive there at 24 years of age, largely unknown to London audiences, was a gamble. And yet, from the very first performances, it became clear that the gamble would pay off brilliantly. She was billed under the name Mrs. Jordan, a stage name she had adopted some years earlier, the exact origin of which has been debated ever since, though it had nothing to do with any formal marriage. She played comedic roles, the Shakespearean heroines who were witty and warm and capable of turning an entire scene with a single well-timed expression. She played Rosalind in As You Like It. She played Viola in Twelfth Night. She played a dozen other parts across the broad tradition of English comedy, and in each of them she brought the same quality: a radiance, a generosity, a sense of genuine delight in the act of performing. Her legs, in the theatrical parlance of the day, were particularly admired. It sounds a strange thing to note in a biography, but in an era when fashion required women of respectable society to be entirely concealed, the freedom of theatrical costume was itself a kind of revelation, and Dorothea Jordan's physical grace was part of what made her performances so alive. She was described repeatedly, and by people who had seen every great performer of the age, as quite possibly the most naturally gifted comic actress then working in England. She was also, by this point, a mother. Her first child, a daughter named Frances, had been born during her touring years, fathered by her first theatre manager, a man named Richard Daly, who was already married, and who recognised no particular obligation toward Dorothea or the child. It was the beginning of a pattern that would define her personal life. Dorothea Jordan was a woman of extraordinary professional achievement who was, in the private sphere of love and relationships, consistently unfortunate. She trusted people she ought not to have trusted, and she gave more than she received. After Frances came 3 more children by a lawyer named Richard Ford, a man who repeatedly promised marriage, allowed Dorothea to use his surname for years as though the promise had already been kept, and then, when a more advantageous match presented itself to him, simply withdrew the promise and went elsewhere. Dorothea bore the disappointment with the stoicism that would come to characterize her whole approach to private suffering. She did not speak publicly of her grief. She continued performing. She continued providing for her children. And then, in 1790, everything changed. The man who would change it was attending a performance at Drury Lane, which was not itself remarkable, since the theatre was fashionable and the high-born and the royal went there frequently. What was rather more remarkable was that the man watching Mrs. Jordan that evening was Prince William Henry, Duke of Clarence and St. Andrews, the third surviving son of King George III. Prince William was 25 years old in 1790, and he had spent much of the preceding decade at sea. He had entered the Royal Navy at 13, served actively for several years, risen to the rank of captain, and seen enough of the world to give him a perspective on life that was, by the standards of British royalty, unusually direct and unaffected. He was not a polished man. He spoke too bluntly, laughed too loudly, and had an almost complete inability to maintain the kind of formal courtly distance that his position might have been expected to require. He was, in short, a sailor, warm, impulsive, and thoroughly genuine. He was also deeply, immediately struck by the woman on the stage. What happened next developed with considerable speed. Within a relatively short period, William and Dorothea had entered into a relationship that both of them seemed to regard from the beginning with a degree of seriousness that went beyond mere attraction. Dorothea moved in with William, first at Clarence Lodge in Roehampton, and then, as the household grew, at a larger residence more appropriate to their expanding circumstances. The relationship was not secret. It could not be secret. Dorothea Jordan was one of the most famous women in England, and the Duke of Clarence was a member of the royal family. The arrangement was known, discussed, and, to a degree that might surprise those who imagine Georgian England as uniformly censorious, broadly tolerated. King George III himself, a man of notably conventional personal morality, made no serious effort to dissolve the connection. He liked William, understood the peculiarities of his son's situation, and extended a pragmatic acceptance to the arrangement. There were reasons for this acceptance beyond simple parental indulgence. The royal family in that era was not, by any stretch, short of scandal. Several of William's brothers had arrangements of their own that were equally irregular, and the idea of a prince maintaining a long-term companionship with a woman of good character but lower social standing, without the formality of marriage, was not, in aristocratic Europe of the period, entirely without precedent. What was unusual was the stability of the arrangement and the evident warmth within it. William and Dorothea did not merely cohabit in the calculating way that some aristocratic liaisons were managed. They lived together, genuinely, as a household. They entertained friends. They shared meals and evenings and the ordinary pleasures of domestic life. And very quickly, they began to have children. In 1797, King George III made his son William the Ranger of Bushy Park, a royal appointment that carried with it the right to reside at Bushy House, a handsome property set within the park itself, not far from Hampton Court. The appointment gave William the comfortable home that a growing family required, and it was to Bushy House that William and Dorothea moved, and where, in the years that followed, their household would expand to become one of the busiest, warmest, and most unconventional establishments in Regency England. The children came steadily. Over the course of their 20 years together, Dorothea Jordan would give birth to 10 children, by the Duke of Clarence, 5 sons and 5 daughters, all of them given the surname FitzClarence, constructed in the Anglo-Norman tradition from Fitz, meaning son of, and Clarence, from William's ducal title. The name announced their parentage openly. It said, without embarrassment, exactly what they were: the children of a prince, born outside the formal bonds of marriage, acknowledged and provided for, but unable to inherit either title or legitimate rank. The 10 FitzClarence children, in order of birth, were George, the eldest, born in 1794, Henry, born in 1795, Sophia, born in 1796, Mary, born in 1798, Frederick, born in 1799, and then, on the 17th of January in the year 1801, the 6th child and the 3rd daughter, Elizabeth. She was born at Bushy House, in the park at Teddington, with the sound of the great park around her, and the warmth of one of England's most unusually happy aristocratic households enclosing her from the very first moments of her life. After Elizabeth came Adolphus, Augusta, Augustus, and finally Amelia, the youngest, born in 1807. 9 of the 10 were named after William's 14 siblings, a quiet act of tribute that also perhaps acknowledged the oddity of a royal family so large it had more siblings than names to go around. They were a remarkable household, by any standard of the age. Bushy House, in the years when Elizabeth FitzClarence grew up within its walls, was a place of unusual life. It was not a grand house in the manner of the great country seats of the English aristocracy, the vast, echoing palaces built to impress visitors with their scale and their owner's importance. Bushy House was comfortable rather than grand, generous rather than magnificent. It had the quality, rare in any household, and rarer still in one with royal connections, of being genuinely lived in. The rooms were full of children and their noise, their games, their arguments and their laughter. The grounds of Bushy Park stretched away around it, offering space for the active outdoor life that the FitzClarence children appeared to have shared with the enthusiasm of young people who had room to run. William, Duke of Clarence, was by all accounts a fond and involved father. He lacked the cold formality that characterized some royal fathers of the era. There was nothing in his manner toward his children of the distant authority that maintained a careful barrier between parent and child. He was warm with them, interested in them, and visibly proud of them in the open, unstudied way that his naval background perhaps encouraged. He had spent years in close quarters with men of every background, eating the same food and facing the same weather, and the easy directness he had learned at sea did not leave him when he came ashore. He treated his children as people worth knowing. Dorothea, meanwhile, was a mother of genuine tenderness, and also, in these years, a woman managing an extraordinary double life. She did not retire from the stage when she moved in with William. She could not afford to. The Duke's parliamentary grant was, by the standards of the royal family, modest, and the household's expenses were real and growing with every new child. Dorothea continued performing, touring, and earning, her income supplementing the household budget in a way that was openly acknowledged and apparently without embarrassment. She was a working mother in the most literal and practical sense, a woman who performed on stage at Drury Lane and Covent Garden and on tour through the provinces, came home to Bushy House, and then returned to the theatre again as circumstances required. This arrangement meant that Elizabeth's early childhood was shaped by a particular kind of domestic rhythm, the coming and going of a mother who was also a public figure, the settled presence of a father who was between his naval years and his eventual royal duties, and the constant company of 8 and eventually 9 siblings who were, in their variety and their numbers, a world unto themselves. What Elizabeth's individual childhood was like in its private particulars, what she read, what games she favoured, what her earliest memories were, these things are not recorded. The historical record when it comes to the domestic lives of the FitzClarence children in their Bushy House years is thin in the way that all records of childhood tend to be thin. Children rarely generate documents. Their joys and their small griefs are recorded only when someone thinks to write them down. And for the FitzClarence children, living in a household that existed in an awkward middle space between official royal recognition and social irregularity, the record keepers of the age were not always attentive. What we can say, with confidence drawn from the broader record, is this: the Bushy House years were, by every available account, years of warmth and stability. The family entertained. William's brothers and their families visited. The children were educated. The boys destined for the military and naval careers that were the expected path for young men of their station. The girls prepared for the aristocratic marriages that would be their most likely futures. There was, in those early years of Elizabeth's life, a sense that the arrangement had found its equilibrium, that the unusual household at Bushy House had settled into something that, if not quite normal, was at least sustainably itself. It was, in retrospect, too settled to last. The world outside Bushy House was not quite as comfortable with the arrangement as those within it. The politics of royal succession were growing more complicated with each passing year. The Prince of Wales, William's eldest brother and the heir apparent, was aging, unhealthy, and estranged from his own wife. The line of succession was not, in the first decade of the 19th century, particularly robust, and there was always, hovering at the edges of any discussion about the Duke of Clarence and his unusual domestic life, The question of what would happen if the succession required more of him, if duty called for something that a relationship with Dorothea Jordan could not provide. For the moment, in Elizabeth's earliest years, these were questions for the future. The present was Bushy House, and the park, and the noise of siblings, and a mother who was one of England's great actresses, and a father who was fond and present and full of the unceremonious warmth of a man who had learned to live without ceremony. It was, by any measure, a remarkable beginning. Elizabeth FitzClarence was 10 years old in 1811, and it was in that year that the world of Bushy House changed, quietly at first, and then completely. The pressures that had been building for years finally reached their conclusion. William, Duke of Clarence, was by 1811 in serious financial difficulty. The parliamentary grant he received was insufficient for the expenses of the household, and the debts that had accumulated over the course of 2 decades of domestic life had grown to a point that could no longer be managed by Dorothea's earnings alone. He needed, his advisors and his family were telling him with increasing urgency, to marry. He needed a wealthy wife, or at the very least, a legitimate one, who could help restore the finances of the household and provide what Dorothea Jordan, however beloved and however much the mother of his children, could never provide. A legitimate heir to stand in the line of succession. There was also, it must be said, the simpler and crueler arithmetic of royal politics. William was 4th in line to the throne, behind his eldest brother, the Prince of Wales, behind the Prince of Wales's daughter, Princess Charlotte, and behind his next eldest surviving brother, the Duke of York. The line was not in immediate crisis, but it was also not as secure as any royal family would wish, and the pressure on every prince of childbearing age to make a proper marriage had been growing for years. In the summer of 1811, William ended his relationship with Dorothea Jordan. The separation was managed, as so many things in the lives of public people are managed, with a combination of practical arrangement and private anguish. William provided Dorothea with a financial settlement, an annual stipend of £4,400, which was, by any ordinary measure, a considerable sum, roughly equivalent to something in the region of £400,000 in modern values. He retained custody of their 5 sons. He allowed Dorothea to take their daughters, which would have included Elizabeth, then 10 years old, with her. There was, however, a condition attached to the stipend that would prove, in the years ahead, to be catastrophic. Dorothea's allowance was contingent upon her not returning to the stage. For as long as she refrained from performing, the money would be paid. The moment she returned to the theatre, it would stop. For the first 3 years after the separation, Dorothea managed. She lived with her daughters, including the teenage Elizabeth, and maintained herself on the stipend, which, while less than the household at Bushy House had cost, was enough for a careful and modest existence. And then, in 1814, everything unravelled. The crisis came through Dorothea's eldest daughter, Frances, the child from the earliest relationship with Richard Daly, who had by now married a man named Thomas Alsop. Alsop had accumulated significant debts, and when those debts became pressing, the family turned to Dorothea for help. She did what she had always done in a crisis. She returned to the stage. She began performing again, accepting engagements to raise money for the debts that her daughter and son-in-law had incurred. When the Duke of Clarence learned that Dorothea had returned to the theatre, he invoked the condition of the settlement. The stipend was stopped, and with it, his patience for the arrangement was apparently exhausted. He reclaimed the daughters, including any of the FitzClarence girls still living with their mother, and the financial support that had kept Dorothea's household functioning was withdrawn entirely. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life earning, who had filled theatres across England and supported children and households and sons-in-law and everyone who came to her with a need, to find herself suddenly without income, without her daughters, and without a path back to the man who had been her companion for 20 years. It was a disaster from which Dora Jordan would not recover. She performed for a little longer, trying to manage the debts that were pressing in from every direction. And then, in 1815, facing creditors she could not satisfy, and a situation that had become untenable, she left England altogether. She crossed to France, moving first to Boulogne, then to Versailles, and finally settling in Saint-Cloud, near Paris. She was travelling under an assumed name. She called herself Madame James, or sometimes Mrs. James, and she was, by this point, neither the celebrated actress nor the royal companion she had been. She was a woman alone and ill, and running out of time. On the 5th of July, 1816, Dorothea Jordan died in Saint-Cloud. She was 54 years old. She died by all available accounts in poverty. The newspaper in Hobart, Tasmania, which later reported on the death of Elizabeth herself, noted that her mother had been dependent on strangers for the very arrangements of her burial. The money to mark the grave came not from the family she had served, but from people who happened to be near. The reports that reached England of Dorothea's death were brief, and not, in the main, particularly kind. There was a legend, which circulated for years afterward, that she had not actually died in 1816, that she had lived on in England under a false name for several more years, too proud or too broken to let the truth of her circumstances be known. Most historians regard this as exactly that, a legend, a story that arose because the truth of her end was too stark to sit comfortably with a public that had adored her on the stage. For Elizabeth FitzClarence, who was 15 years old when her mother died in France, the loss arrived at a distance and in circumstances that were beyond her ability to address. There is no record of whether Elizabeth and her siblings were able to attend any kind of memorial. There is no record of the grief she may have felt, or the complicated emotions that must have surrounded the death of a mother from whom she had already been separated for 4 years. The historical record, at this particular point, is silent. What we can say is that Elizabeth grew up with 2 legacies from this period. The first was the undeniable pain of a childhood interrupted, of a warm household that one morning became 2 separate diminished households, of a mother who left and did not return. The second was the example of Dorothea Jordan herself, a woman of extraordinary talent and resilience, who had navigated the world on her own terms for as long as she was able, and who had loved and had been loved, and had given more than she received, and had done all of it without the protection that legitimate social standing might have offered. It is not difficult to imagine that Elizabeth, growing up in the years after 1811, reflected on that example in the way that daughters reflect on their mothers, with complexity, and with something that goes deeper than simple admiration or simple grief. Meanwhile, at Bushy House, life continued. The FitzClarence sons were entering their military and naval careers. The daughters were growing up in their father's household, now moving toward the age at which the question of marriage would become not theoretical, but practical and pressing. And the Duke of Clarence himself, after several unsuccessful attempts to secure the wealthy heiress that his finances required, he had pursued at least one notable candidate who declined him firmly, was moving toward the legitimate marriage that duty demanded. In 1818, William, Duke of Clarence, married Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen at Kew Palace. Adelaide was a woman of considerable personal virtue and apparent warmth. She was 25 years old to William's 52, younger than several of his illegitimate children, and she entered her new marriage with what appears to have been a genuine willingness to embrace the unusual circumstances of the family she was joining. Queen Adelaide, as she would eventually become, is reported to have been kind and accepting toward the FitzClarence children, treating them with a warmth that was noted and appreciated by those who observed the household. When other members of the extended royal family expressed discomfort at the FitzClarences' presence at court, Adelaide stood up for them. When gossip circulated, she declined to encourage it. Whatever complications the situation presented, she navigated them with a grace that seems to have earned her genuine affection from William's illegitimate children, including, we may assume, Elizabeth. In the years between her parents' separation and her own marriage, Elizabeth FitzClarence occupied the particular social position that was hers and her siblings alone, the position of the acknowledged royal illegitimate. It was a position that had its own peculiar tensions. On one hand, the FitzClarence children were the children of a prince who was increasingly significant in the line of succession, and they were received in many of the great houses of England accordingly. They were known, recognized, and, particularly after their father's star began to rise toward its eventual royal culmination, treated with the kind of careful deference that royal connection, even illegitimate royal connection, commanded. On the other hand, they held no formal titles, could claim no place in the line of succession, and existed in that socially awkward middle ground between acknowledged nobility and the margins of official recognition. Elizabeth grew up understanding this position and navigating it with what appears, from the available evidence, to have been considerable composure. She was, by the accounts of those who knew the FitzClarence family, a young woman of pleasant manner and quiet dignity, not the flamboyant public presence that her mother had been, but not the shrinking, self-effacing figure that illegitimate royal children were sometimes expected to become either. She was, by the year 1820, 19 years old, and approaching the question of marriage with the practical awareness that Victorian historians might have called prudence, and that we might simply call realism. For a young woman in her position, royal blood, no legitimate title, no independent fortune, dependent on her father's goodwill and the social capital of her connection to the House of Hanover, a good marriage was not merely desirable, it was necessary. The marriage that presented itself in the autumn of 1820 was with William George Hay, who was at that point the 18th Earl of Erroll. He was 19 years old, born on the 21st of February, 1801, barely 5 weeks after Elizabeth herself, and he had become Earl of Erroll the previous year, when his father died on the 26th of January, 1819. He was, in other words, a young man who had inherited an ancient and significant Scottish title at the age of 18, and who was now, at 19, preparing to marry the acknowledged daughter of the man who seemed increasingly likely to one day wear the crown. The earldom of Erroll was not simply a title. It was one of the oldest and most significant peerages in Scotland. Created in 1453 by King James II of Scotland for Sir William Hay, the earldom carried with it the hereditary office of Lord High Constable of Scotland, an ancient and ceremonially important position that placed the holder at the very summit of Scottish ceremonial life. The Lord High Constable of Scotland had once commanded the Scottish Royal Army in the field. In the 19th century, the office retained its great symbolic weight, even as its practical military function had long since passed into history. The Earls of Erroll were also the hereditary chiefs of Clan Hay, a Scottish clan of considerable antiquity, descending from a Scoto-Norman knight named Guillaume de la Haye, whose name appears in Scottish records from around 1160. The Hay family had been among the great families of Scotland for centuries, their influence running through the long, complicated history of Scottish kingship. Their castle at Slains on the Aberdeenshire coast, commanding one of the most dramatic stretches of the North Sea coast, their seat at House of Dun in Angus, connected through the marriage of an earlier generation to the same remarkable social circle that would come to include the FitzClarence family. William Hay, 18th Earl of Erroll, had been educated at Eton, the school that educated much of the English aristocracy, which said something about the extent to which the Scottish peerage, by the early 19th century, was fully integrated into the broader British social world. He was, by available accounts, a young man of serious temperament and political interest. He would go on to be elected a Scottish representative peer and take his seat in the House of Lords, and he would serve in a series of court and governmental positions that reflected his Whig political sympathies and his willingness to be involved in the public life of the country. His elder brother had been killed during the Waterloo campaign in 1815, which was how William had come to be heir to the earldom rather than simply a younger son, a shadow of personal loss that had shaped his entry into the title he now held, and that perhaps gave him an awareness of contingency and impermanence that young men who inherit titles smoothly sometimes lack. The match between Elizabeth FitzClarence and William Hay, 18th Earl of Erroll, was, by any measure of the age, a good one. He brought ancient title and Scottish lands. She brought royal connection, the blood of the House of Hanover, running through her veins even if it could not be formally acknowledged in the succession. And between them, perhaps, there was simply the compatibility of two 19-year-olds who had found each other at the right moment. The wedding took place on the 4th of December, 1820. The venue was St. George's Church in Hanover Square, one of the most fashionable churches in London, used for the weddings of the well-born and the socially prominent, set in the heart of the Mayfair district that was then, as it remains today, the address of wealth and consequence in the capital. The ceremony was attended by family and by the social circle that surrounded the FitzClarence household, not a state occasion, not a royal wedding in any formal sense, but a wedding of genuine significance at which a royal daughter, however informally acknowledged, was given in marriage to one of Scotland's oldest noble titles. Elizabeth FitzClarence became, on that December day, Elizabeth Hay, Countess of Erroll, and the connection between the two families immediately began to reshape the position of the Hay family at court. William Hay's marriage to a daughter of the Duke of Clarence, who was by 1820 moving steadily toward the moment when he would be expected to take the throne, was not simply a personal alliance. It was a social and political one, and it would, in the years ahead, prove consequential for the public career of the 18th Earl of Erroll in ways that neither party could entirely have predicted on their wedding day. The early years of Elizabeth's marriage coincided with some of the most turbulent and significant years in the early 19th century British history. She and William Hay settled into the life of a young aristocratic couple, navigating the demands of his estate obligations, his emerging political career, and the social world of a London that was, in the 1820s, still finding its way between the Georgian era that was passing and the Victorian age that was not yet arrived. Their first child, a daughter named Ida Harriet Augusta Hay, was born on the 18th of October, 1821, barely a year after the wedding. Elizabeth was 20 years old. Their son, William Harry Hay, the future 19th Earl of Erroll, followed on the 3rd of May, 1823. 2 years later, William Hay was elected a Scottish representative peer and took his seat in the House of Lords, a position that required him to be in London during parliamentary sessions, drawing the family into the political rhythms of the capital and giving William Hay a platform from which to develop the Whig political commitments that would define his public career. The social world into which Elizabeth had married was, in these years, one shaped by the peculiarities of the Regency court and the shifting alliances of aristocratic Britain. The FitzClarence family occupied an unusual position within it. acknowledged by the Duke of Clarence, received at court, present at the social occasions that structured aristocratic life, and yet carrying always the particular weight of their irregular birth, Elizabeth navigated this world with the quiet composure that seems to have characterized her adult life, attending to the demands of her household and her children, supporting her husband's public career, and maintaining the family connections that kept the FitzClarence siblings in each other's orbits. The decade of the 1820s brought significant changes to the broader landscape of the family's circumstances. In 1820, King George III died, and the Prince of Wales became King George IV. He was by this point already long estranged from his wife, already long in poor health, and his reign was marked by the continued political turbulence that the Reform era was generating across the country. For William, Duke of Clarence, George's accession moved him one step closer to the throne. He was now second in line, behind only the aging and increasingly infirm new king. And then, in 1817, the event that had placed William on the cusp of the succession had already occurred. Princess Charlotte, the Prince of Wales's only daughter, and the most immediately popular candidate for the throne in the eyes of the English public, had died in childbirth, along with her stillborn son. The loss of Charlotte had been a genuine national grief, and it had transformed the question of royal succession from a theoretical concern to an urgent and practical one. Every unmarried prince of the right age was suddenly required to find a legitimate wife and produce legitimate heirs. William had found his wife in Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen. What remained to be seen was whether Adelaide could provide the heirs that the succession required. She could not. Adelaide's pregnancies in the early 1820s resulted in daughters who died in infancy, and then in no further children at all. The marriage was by all accounts a genuinely affectionate one. William and Adelaide appeared to have liked and respected each other sincerely, but it was not producing the legitimate heir that would settle the question of succession. The result was that the FitzClarence children, none of whom could inherit the throne, no matter how great their number or their loyalty to their father, remained in a position that was simultaneously prominent and precarious. For Elizabeth, this meant that the question of her social standing would always carry a particular edge. She was the daughter of the man who would very likely be the next king. She was the wife of one of Scotland's premier earls. She was received at the highest levels of society. And yet she was also, always, the illegitimate daughter, the one who could not be formally placed in the line of succession, who owed her position entirely to the goodwill of a father whose own position had not yet achieved its final elevation. The elevation came on the 26th of June, 1830. King George IV died, after a reign of 10 years marked more by controversy and personal excess than by political achievement. The second Hanoverian king, who bore the name George, passed from the scene, and William, Duke of Clarence, now 64 years old, the oldest man to have ascended to the British throne in the modern era, became King William IV. The accession of her father to the throne changed Elizabeth's world immediately and materially. Almost at once, the FitzClarence children were raised in social rank. William IV ensured that his illegitimate children were given the status of the younger children of a marquess, a formal recognition of their position that stopped short of legitimizing them or placing them in the succession, but that gave them the social standing they had always occupied informally and now could claim officially. Elizabeth, as the Countess of Erroll through her marriage, already had a title of her own, but the elevation of her family's position was felt across the whole network of FitzClarence connections and alliances. Her husband's career benefited directly. William Hay's appointment as Master of the Horse to Queen Adelaide in 1830, a court position of considerable dignity, responsible for the management of the royal mews and the ceremonial horses of the household, was a direct consequence of his marriage to the new king's daughter. The position brought him into close contact with the court, gave him a formal role in the ceremonial life of the monarchy, and confirmed the Hay family's place in the inner circle of the new reign. In 1831, William Hay was made a member of the Privy Council, a mark of royal trust and political confidence that very few Scottish peers of his generation received at so young an age. He was 30 years old. The connection to Elizabeth, and through her to William IV, was clearly a factor in this rapid rise, but it would be a mistake to attribute everything to nepotism. William Hay was, by available accounts, a competent and conscientious political figure, a Whig in a period when Whig politics were moving toward the great constitutional reforms that would transform British public life, and a peer who took his responsibilities seriously enough to earn recognition on his own terms. The great year of William III's reign, in political terms, was 1832, the year of the Reform Act, the act which expanded the electorate significantly and redistributed parliamentary seats away from the rotten boroughs that had made a mockery of the idea of representation, was one of the defining legislative achievements of the early 19th century. William IV was not personally an enthusiastic reformer. He was suspicious of social change and clashed repeatedly with his ministers over the pace and extent of what was being proposed. But he did, ultimately, allow the reform to pass, and in doing so, he participated in one of the shifts that moved British political life in the direction it would follow for the rest of the century. For Elizabeth and her husband, this was the world they inhabited, the world of a monarchy under pressure to modernize, of an aristocracy navigating the demands of a changing political landscape, of a Britain in transition between one era and the next. William Hay served as Master of Buckhounds from 1835 to 1839, another court appointment, another indicator of the family's position within the governmental and social structure of the Whig era. He was Lord Lieutenant of Aberdeenshire from 1836 to 1846, the principal representative of the Crown in one of Scotland's most significant counties, and then, from 1839 to 1841, he served as Lord Steward of the Household, the most senior domestic officer of the royal household, responsible for the overall management of the sovereign's domestic arrangements, a position of very considerable prestige and administrative responsibility. The period when William Hay was Lord Steward coincided with the first years of Queen Victoria's reign. Victoria had ascended to the throne on the 20th of June, 1837, when William IV died at Windsor Castle. He was 71 years old, and his reign of just under 7 years had seen the passing of the Reform Act, the abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire, and the beginning of the transition to the constitutional monarchy that Victoria would continue to develop over the course of her long reign. For Elizabeth FitzClarence, who had been a child when her father was simply the Duke of Clarence, who had grown up in the shadow of the court without quite belonging to it, who had been present at the margins of royal life for her entire adult existence, the death of her father was the end of something that had defined her world from its very first day. She was 36 years old. The years of William IV's reign and the early years of Victoria's were the years in which Elizabeth's family was growing and taking on its own shape. The years when the children she and William Hay had raised were stepping into the world and making their own places within it. The eldest daughter, Ida Harriet Augusta Hay, had grown up to be a young woman of social grace and personal charm. In 1838, she had the distinction of being chosen as one of Queen Victoria's bridesmaids, an honour that said something about the position the Hay family occupied at court, and about the extent to which Elizabeth's children were recognised as belonging to the inner circles of the royal social world, despite the irregularity of their grandmother's situation. Ida married Charles Noel, the second Earl of Gainsborough, And through that marriage, her descendants would include the later Earls of Gainsborough and the Marquesses of Bute, another thread in the long genealogical web that Elizabeth's life was quietly weaving across the English and Scottish aristocracies. Her son, William Harry Hay, who had served as a page of honour at court first to William IV and then to Victoria, would in time become the 19th Earl of Erroll after his father's death, inheriting the ancient title and its obligations and continuing the line into the Victorian era. The third child and the second daughter was Agnes Georgiana Elizabeth Hay, born on the 12th of May 1829 in Dublin. Agnes would prove to be, in terms of her dynastic legacy, the most significant of Elizabeth's children, though the full extent of that significance would not become clear until several decades after Elizabeth herself was gone. Agnes was raised under what her own later biographers describe as the close supervision of her mother, a phrase that suggests Elizabeth took a particular interest in the upbringing of this daughter, though the details of that supervision are not recorded. Agnes was, by the accounts that survive, a young woman of intelligence and social capability, and the match she made reflected both qualities. In March of 1846, Agnes married James Duff, the man who would later become, upon the death of his childless uncle, the 5th Earl Fife. The wedding was held at the British Embassy in Paris in March of 1846, and it was an event that brought the family together at what would prove to be one of the last moments of something like ordinary happiness before the losses that were coming. Because in April of 1846, just a few weeks after Agnes's wedding in Paris, William Hay, the 18th Earl of Erroll, died. He was 45 years old. He died on the 19th of April 1846 at Portman Square in London of complications from diabetes. He was buried in the churchyard of St Mary's Church in Wimbledon, in the London borough of Merton, and it was there, at that Wimbledon churchyard, that Elizabeth would one day be buried beside him. Elizabeth FitzClarence became a widow in April of 1846, at the age of 45, and she remained a widow for nearly a decade. The death of William Hay was by any measure a significant loss. They had been married for 26 years, not quite the whole of Elizabeth's adult life, but very nearly so. He had been her companion through the deaths of her parents, through the accession and death of her father, through the births and upbringings of their 4 children, through the political and social world of Regency and early Victorian England. The life they had built together at the intersection of Scottish noble tradition and Hanoverian royal connection was, by the evidence of everything that followed, a life Elizabeth valued deeply. The years of her widowhood are, in the historical record, the least well-documented period of her life. There are no diaries that survive, no correspondence that has been collected and preserved in a way that would allow us to follow her days and thoughts during this period. What we know is gathered from the edges of other people's accounts, from genealogical records, from the occasional newspaper reference, from the documents generated by her children's marriages and her grandchildren's births. We know that she spent time in Scotland. Her son was now the 19th Earl of Erroll, carrying the ancient title and the obligations that came with it, and the family connections to the Scottish estates and social world that had been part of her married life continued through him. We know that she maintained the relationships with her FitzClarence siblings that had been a constant thread through her life, those brothers and sisters who shared with her the particular experience of being born into an extraordinary household and then watching that household disperse, and who were bound together by ties that went deeper than ordinary family affection, because they had shared something that no one outside their circle could entirely understand. It is during this period of her widowhood that one of the most quietly telling details of Elizabeth's life comes into focus. At the House of Dun, the elegant house in Angus that had connections to the extended FitzClarence circle through the family of her sister Augusta, there hung a family portrait of the FitzClarence children, a painting that gathered, in the careful formal way of the Victorian period, the faces of those brothers and sisters into a single frame. Elizabeth was among them, her image fixed at whatever age the portrait was made, part of the record of a family that had lived its remarkable, irregular, warm and complicated life in the long shadow of royal England. And at some point in her life, it is not recorded exactly when, but it speaks of a daughter's love that no amount of social difficulty or political complication entirely extinguished. Elizabeth had come into possession of two mementos of her father. The first was a stone, not a gemstone, not a decorative object, but an ordinary stone, the kind thrown at a person in anger, in protest, in the rough and sometimes violent idiom of public feeling in the early 19th century. The stone had been thrown at King William IV during one of the moments when his public appearances attracted the hostility that the early Reform era could generate. That Elizabeth kept it says something about her relationship with her father, that she held onto the evidence of the dangers he faced, perhaps as a kind of talisman, perhaps as a reminder of the vulnerability that even kings could not entirely escape. The second memento was a pair of gloves, the gloves that William IV had worn at the opening of his first parliament. Together, these two objects, a stone thrown at a king and the gloves he wore at his most formal public ceremony, form a quietly eloquent portrait of a daughter's complicated affection. They represent the full range of what kingship meant in the Hanoverian age, the grandeur and the exposure, the ceremony and the danger, the public theatre and the private cost. That Elizabeth kept them, and presumably kept them close, says more about her inner world than almost any other detail the historical record offers us. The 1840s passed into the 1850s, and the world around Elizabeth continued to change. Her children were making their own lives. Ida married to Gainsborough, William as the new Earl of Erroll, Agnes the wife of James Duff, and increasingly the mother of a growing family. Her youngest daughter, Alice Mary Emily Hay, born in 1835, was still a young woman in these years, and would make her own marriage in due course. Agnes's family was, by this point, growing in ways that would eventually have significance far beyond anything Elizabeth could have anticipated. Her daughter Agnes and her husband James Duff were the parents of several children, including a son who would in time become Alexander Duff, a man who would one day marry Princess Louise, the eldest daughter of the Prince of Wales, and be created Duke of Fife by Queen Victoria. Through that marriage, Elizabeth's bloodline would reach directly into the heart of the Victorian royal family, the family that had always been connected to hers by the ties of shared ancestry and mutual history, but from which she had always been separated by the barrier of her illegitimate birth. The irony of it is not small. The illegitimate granddaughter of a king, through her own illegitimate daughter's legitimate descendants, would become the grandmother of a man who married a princess, carrying the blood of Dora Jordan and William IV Thorne into the very centre of royal legitimacy. To understand Elizabeth's widowhood and the years that led to her death, it helps to understand something of the world of her brothers and sisters, because the FitzClarence siblings were, throughout their adult lives, bound to each other in ways that shaped everything they did. There were 10 of them in all, and each had found a different path through the unusual world into which they had been born. George, the eldest, George FitzClarence, the first Earl of Munster, had been the most formally elevated of all the siblings. Their father, on his accession to the throne in 1830, had created George an Earl, a Viscount, and a Baron, raising him to the peerage in a way that gave formal structure to the status the family had always informally held. George had served in the army, fought in the Peninsular War in Spain, served subsequently in India, and had a distinguished military career before the growing frustrations of his position. He was the king's eldest son, formally acknowledged and yet unable to inherit, formally elevated and yet unable to claim the full recognition he felt he deserved, contributed to a deteriorating mental state that ended tragically. Henry FitzClarence, the second child and second son, had died young in 1817 at 22, the loss of a brother that preceded by several years the loss of their mother. Sophia, the eldest daughter, had married Philip Sidney, a man who would become the first Baron de Lisle and Dudley, and had lived into the middle decades of the century. Mary, the fourth FitzClarence child, had married a man named Charles Fox and had lived a quieter life than some of her siblings, eventually becoming a writer, a tribute, perhaps, to the literary and theatrical inheritance of their mother's world. Frederick, the fifth child, had served as a general in the army and died in India in 1854, a soldier's death far from the England where he had grown up. Adolphus, the seventh child, had had a naval career, rising to become a rear admiral, eventually a vice admiral, and had remained, throughout his life, particularly close to Elizabeth. It was toward Adolphus that Elizabeth was travelling in the winter of 1856, when her own health failed. Augusta, the eighth child, had married twice, first to a man named Kennedy Erskine, with whom she had 3 children, and then to an admiral named Lord Frederick Halyburton. It was Augusta's first husband's family that had the connection to the House of Dun in Angus, and the family portrait that hung there was a product of those connections. Augustus, the ninth child, had also pursued a military career, dying in 1854. Amelia, the youngest, had married a Viscount Falkland and died in 1858. By the 1850s, the world of the FitzClarence generation was winding down. The brothers and sisters who had filled Bushy House with noise and life in the first decade of the century were aging, and several were already gone. The letters that passed between the survivors, the visits they paid to each other's households, the quiet loyalties that the shared experience of their unusual upbringing had created, these were the threads that still held the family together, and it was one of these threads, the bond between Elizabeth and her brother Adolphus, that would determine the circumstances of her death. January 1856. Elizabeth FitzClarence, Countess Dowager of Erroll, was 54 years old and in declining health. She had been spending time at the estate of her daughter Agnes and son-in-law James Duff in the north of Scotland, that country which had always had a particular claim on the Hay family, from the ancient Aberdeenshire roots of the earldom to the Angus connections of the House of Dun. The news that reached her in early January was not good. Her brother Adolphus, the Vice Admiral, was seriously ill. He was dying. His condition had deteriorated to the point where those around him felt that the time remaining to him was short, and that the family should be summoned if there was to be any chance of saying farewell. Elizabeth, herself unwell, made the decision to go. It was a decision that speaks to who she was, a woman who, when the moment required it, set aside her own comfort and health for the sake of the bonds that mattered to her. Adolphus was her brother, her companion through the long decades since the dispersal of the Bushy House household, one of the remaining threads of a generation that was passing. She would not allow him to die without making the effort to reach him. She left Agnes's estate in the north. She travelled south, making her way toward England. On the Saturday before her death, she stayed at Wemyss Castle at Dysart, on the coast of Fife, one of the ancient strongholds of that Scottish coast, where the North Sea wind came off the water cold and sharp. And then she reached Edinburgh. In Edinburgh, her condition worsened. The symptoms that had been manageable became alarming. The family received word, telegraphic messages, in the new technology of communication that the Victorian era was deploying across the country. Early in the morning, Lady Mary Fox, her sister, left London on the express train and hurried north. Other family members were summoned when Elizabeth's condition moved into what the death notice would later describe as imminent danger. At 5 minutes to 11 o'clock on the morning of the 16th of January, 1856, Elizabeth Hay, Countess Dowager of Erroll, born Elizabeth FitzClarence, daughter of William IV, and Dora Jordan, royal bastard, Countess of Scotland's most ancient earldom, mother of 4 children and grandmother of a dynasty, died. The cause, as reported in the London Evening Standard the following day, was congestion of the brain. It was, in modern terms, most probably a stroke or a related cerebral event, the kind of sudden, catastrophic illness that in an era before modern medicine gave no warning and allowed no treatment. The date of her death was the 16th of January, 1856. She was 1 day short of her 55th birthday. The London Evening Standard's death notice, a formal announcement of the kind that the Victorian press issued for people of social consequence, recorded the circumstances with the measured language of the period. It noted that she was the daughter of the late King William IV and Mrs. Jordan. It noted that she had been summoned from Scotland to hasten to the sickbed of her brother, Lord Adolphus FitzClarence. It listed the family members who had been present at her passing: Lady Mary Fox, who had made it in time to be with her sister at the end; Lady Augustus FitzClarence, her sister-in-law; Lady Agnes Duff, her daughter; the Earl of Erroll, her son; Viscount Camden and Viscountess Camden; her daughter Ida, and Ida's husband. The irony that the death notice noted, but did not explicitly observe, was this: Elizabeth had set out to be with her dying brother, and she had died before she could reach him. Adolphus died shortly afterward, in the same year. The sister had gone first, on a journey made for love. She was buried at St. Mary's Church in Wimbledon, beside her husband William Hay, the 18th Earl of Erroll, who had been waiting there in the churchyard since April of 1846. The life of Elizabeth FitzClarence did not end in Edinburgh in January of 1856. It continued in the lives of the people who came after her, in the ways her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren moved through the world, carrying in their blood and their social position the inheritance of that warm and irregular household at Bushy House, the ancient dignity of the Scottish earldom of Erroll, and the quiet, complicated legacy of a woman who had lived her whole life at the intersection of royal blood and social irregularity. Her son, William Harry Hay, the 19th Earl of Erroll, carried the ancient title into the Victorian age, maintaining the hereditary position of Lord High Constable of Scotland and the chieftainship of Clan Hay that came with it. He married Eliza Amelia Gore in 1848 and had 7 children, extending the Erroll line into the later decades of the century. Her eldest daughter Ida, the Countess of Gainsborough, left behind descendants who would include the later Earls of Gainsborough and the Marquesses of Bute, threads of aristocratic connection that ran through Victorian and Edwardian England, carrying in them the genetic inheritance of Dorothea Jordan's Irish blood and William IV's Hanoverian blood, and the ancient Scottish blood of the House of Hay. But it was through Agnes, the 3rd child, the 2nd daughter, born in Dublin in 1829, that Elizabeth's most remarkable dynastic legacy extended. Agnes had married James Duff, who became the 5th Earl Fife. Together, they had several children, including a son named Alexander Duff. Alexander Duff grew up to be a man of substance and social prominence, and in 1889 he made a marriage that placed the FitzClarence bloodline at the very heart of the British royal family. He married Princess Louise, Princess Royal, the eldest daughter of Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, the man who would eventually become King Edward VII. The marriage of Elizabeth's grandson to a daughter of the future king was, in its dynastic symbolism, extraordinary. It meant that the illegitimate daughter of William IV, the woman who had been born outside the formal bounds of royal marriage, raised in the irregular household of Bushy House, married into Scottish nobility, and spent her life navigating the peculiar social position of the acknowledged royal bastard, had, through the generations of her descendants, reached back into the royal family itself. Queen Victoria created Alexander Duff, the Duke of Fife, in recognition of the marriage. The daughters of that marriage, Princesses Alexandra and Maud, were granddaughters of King Edward VII and great-granddaughters of Queen Victoria, and they were also great-granddaughters of Elizabeth FitzClarence. The web of connection did not stop there. Through another line of descent, running through Agnes's daughter, Lady Agnes Duff, who married Alfred Cooper, Elizabeth became an ancestor of one of the most recognizable British political figures of the early 21st century. Former Prime Minister David Cameron, who served as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 2010 to 2016, is a fourth great-grandson of Elizabeth FitzClarence. The connection, confirmed by Debrett's, the authority on British genealogy and peerage, makes Cameron the fifth cousin twice removed of Queen Elizabeth II. It is the kind of genealogical fact that illuminates something about the nature of hereditary aristocracy, the way in which blood moves through generations, dispersing and reconcentrating, connecting people who are separated by centuries and apparently by entirely different social worlds, reminding us that the past is never quite as past as it appears. Elizabeth FitzClarence would not have known any of this. She died in Edinburgh in 1856, 33 years before her grandson married a princess, and over a century before the distant descendant who would become Prime Minister was born. She died knowing only what she could know, that she had raised children who were launched into the world and doing well in it, that she had been a countess and a mother and a widow, that she had loved her siblings and been loved by them, that she had kept a stone and a pair of gloves as mementos of a father she had complicated feelings about, and that she had made one last journey through the Scottish winter to be with a dying brother, and had not quite made it in time. We cannot leave Elizabeth's story without returning, one final time, to the woman who began it, to Dora Jordan, who died in St. Cloud in 1816, and was buried there by strangers, and whose life was for many years the subject of a kind of wistful, guilty forgetting. She had been, in her time, one of the most celebrated women in England. She had been painted by Sir Joshua Reynolds. She had been the subject of portraits by Thomas Gainsborough and George Romney, the finest portraitists of the Georgian age, men who painted the famous and the beautiful and the powerful and the interesting, and who found in Dora Jordan all of those qualities together. She had filled Drury Lane for 25 years. She had been spoken of in terms that placed her among the greatest actors, male or female, of her generation, and she had been left behind. William, Duke of Clarence, had ended the relationship when duty required it. He had provided for her, in the formal sense. The stipend was real. The custody arrangement was real. The acknowledgement of the children was genuine and lasting. But the moment when he walked away from Bushy House and from Dorothea, the weight of what she had given and what she was losing must have been almost impossible to bear. She had given 20 years of her life. She had given 10 children. She had continued acting through pregnancies and recoveries, through the demands of a household and the demands of an audience, because the household needed the income that only she could earn. She had done all of this without the protection of marriage, without the social standing that marriage would have conferred, and in the full knowledge that the arrangement depended, ultimately, on the goodwill of a man who was not hers to keep. The tragedy of her final years, the son-in-law's debts, The return to the stage, the withdrawal of the stipend, the exile to France, had a particular cruelty about it. It was not, in the strict technical sense, William's fault. He had given her the stipend, and the condition was clear. When she broke the condition, he withdrew the support. The logic was clean, but the effect, an aging woman, once the most famous actress in England, dying alone in a French suburb, her linen sold to pay for the funeral, was not clean at all. William IV, to his credit, did not entirely forget her. After he became king in 1830, he commissioned a statue of Dorothea, sculpted by the eminent Sir Francis Chantrey, and the statue was placed in a position where it could be seen, a formal acknowledgement of a woman whose existence the court had spent years carefully not quite acknowledging. The children she had borne and raised and worried about, all 10 of them, who had continued living their lives after her departure in 1811 and her death in 1816, had none of them, by the end, turned out badly. They had made aristocratic marriages. They had served in the military and the navy. They had sat in the House of Lords. They had been received at court. They had been, in the terms available to them, successful. The price of that success had been their mother's sacrifice, and the distance that separated them from her in her final years, a distance that Elizabeth, who was 15 when Dorothea died, would have felt with whatever complicated mixture of grief and helplessness she brought to it, was the price that the arrangement had always demanded. The world did not entirely forget Dorothea Jordan. Her performances were remembered by those who had seen them, and written about by critics who had watched her work for decades. The memoir of her life, published in the years after her death, kept her story in circulation. And in the 20th century, the biographer Claire Tomalin wrote a full and sympathetic account of her life that restored to the historical record the complexity and dignity that Dorothea had always deserved. But for Elizabeth FitzClarence, the question of her mother was not a historical one. It was personal. It was the question of a woman who had lost her mother at 15, in circumstances of considerable pain, and who carried that loss through 40 more years of life without anyone ever recording what she thought about it. The 2 mementos, the stone and the gloves, were kept for her father. There is no record of what she kept for her mother. Perhaps nothing can be kept for the people who leave us before we have learned what to ask for, because Elizabeth spent the central decades of her adult life as Countess of Erroll, and because it was through that earldom that her most significant social identity was formed. It is worth pausing to understand something of the house she had married into, and the ancient dignity that came with it. The earldom of Erroll is one of the oldest titles in the Scottish peerage. It was created in 1453 by King James II of Scotland for Sir William Hay, a man of considerable consequence in the political and military life of 15th century Scotland. The subsidiary titles attached to it, Lord Hay, created in 1449, and Lord Slains, created in 1452, were themselves among the oldest of Scottish baronies, and together they formed a layered structure of dignities that spoke to centuries of accumulated standing. But the most remarkable element of the Erroll title was not any of these individual honours. It was the hereditary office that came with the earldom, the position of Lord High Constable of Scotland. The Lord High Constable of Scotland was, in origin, one of the supreme officers of the Scottish kingdom. In the medieval period, the constable commanded the Scottish Royal Army in the field, bearing responsibility for the safety and order of the royal person in time of war, and holding authority over all matters of military justice within the realm. The Hays had held this office as a hereditary right since the 14th century, an unbroken succession of constables stretching across the long, complicated centuries of Scottish history. By the time Elizabeth married into the family in 1820, the military power of the Lord High Constable was of course long since ceremonial rather than practical. Scotland had been united with England since 1707. The separate Scottish army had ceased to exist, and the great battles of medieval Scottish independence were centuries in the past. But the ceremonial dignity of the office remained very much alive, and the Lord High Constable of Scotland still had specific responsibilities at Scottish royal occasions, the coronations of monarchs, the formal state visits of sovereigns to Scotland, the great ceremonial moments at which the ancient dignities of the Scottish kingdom were displayed. It was, in other words, an office that connected the holder directly to the deepest roots of Scottish royal history, to the Bruce, to Wallace, to the long tradition of Scottish kingship that had finally merged, though not without struggle, into the British monarchy that was Elizabeth's own inheritance through her father's line. The Hay family also carried the hereditary title of Chief of Clan Hay, the leaders of a clan that traced its origins to the same Scoto-Norman knight, Guillaume de la Haye, who had arrived in Scotland around 1160 and whose descendants had spent the subsequent 7 centuries weaving themselves into the fabric of Scottish life. The clan and the chieftainship gave William Hay a different kind of social authority than his parliamentary or court positions, a more ancient, more personal kind, rooted in the loyalties and identities of Scottish Highland tradition. The ancestral castle of Slains on the Aberdeenshire coast, a dramatic ruin even in Elizabeth's day, set on cliffs above the North Sea, was one of the great atmospheric presences of the Hay family's Scottish past. It was, by the 19th century, no longer the family's primary seat, but it remained part of the landscape of the Hay identity, and its ruins were visited and written about by travellers who found in them the sublime melancholy that the Romantic era had taught the world to seek in ruined fortifications and stormy coastlines. Elizabeth, through her marriage, had become part of all of this. The ancient dignity, the Scottish ceremonial life, the clan traditions, the dramatic coastal landscape, the Bushy House girl, born to the most famous actress in England and the man who would be king, had become the Countess of one of Scotland's oldest and most storied noble houses. It was a remarkable trajectory for a life that had begun in social irregularity. To understand Elizabeth's life, we must understand something of the man at its centre, not as he appeared to history, as the brief and somewhat underrated monarch who bridged the Georgian and Victorian eras, but as he appeared to his children, the father at Bushy House, the man who loved them and provided for them, and then, by the demands of his position, changed the shape of their lives forever. William IV is not, in the broad sweep of British royal history, one of the monarchs who commands the greatest attention. He reigned for fewer than 7 years, from 1830 to 1837, and his reign is overshadowed on one side by the long, dramatic story of the Regency era, and on the other by the extraordinary 63 years of Victoria's reign. He tends to appear in the popular imagination, when he appears at all, as a genial, slightly buffoonish sailor king, the man who walked unaccompanied through London, who invited random hotel guests to dine with him, who opened parts of Windsor Great Park to the public, who was, by the careful standards of the Hanoverian court, refreshingly uninterested in ceremony for its own sake. This is not an entirely inaccurate portrait. William IV was genuinely informal in a way that his predecessors had not been, genuinely accessible in a way that the court had not always welcomed, and genuinely fond of his subjects in the broad, uncomplicated way of a man who had spent his formative years in the company of ordinary sailors. He was also tactless, occasionally crude, and given to the kind of blunt statement that served him well at sea and somewhat less well in the rarefied world of political negotiation. But he was also, and this matters for Elizabeth's story, a man of genuine feeling. His love for Dorothea Jordan had been real enough to sustain a relationship for 20 years, to produce 10 children, to create a household that those who knew it remembered with warmth for decades afterward. His love for those children was real enough to ensure they were formally acknowledged, formally elevated, received at court, married into good families, and given every social advantage that he could provide within the constraints of their illegitimate birth. The relationship between Elizabeth and her father must have been one of considerable complexity. He was the man who had ended her mother's happiness. He was the man who had taken Elizabeth and her siblings away from Dorothea when the conditions of the separation were violated. He was, in the formal sense, responsible for the circumstances that left Dorothea Jordan to die alone in France, and he was also the man she had known at Bushy House as a child, the warm, informal, fond father who had been present in their lives in a way that many aristocratic fathers of the period were not. He was the man whose gloves she kept. He was the man from whose public appearances she preserved a stone, because she had felt, hearing that he had been threatened, something that even the pain of his choices could not extinguish. When William IV died in 1837, Elizabeth was 36 years old. She had known him for all of her life, loved him with whatever complicated mixture of feelings such a relationship produced, and watched him become first a duke, then a king, and then a man who died having produced, in the long accounting of history, exactly 2 legitimate children, both daughters, both dead in infancy, and 10 illegitimate ones, who outlived him and carried his bloodline into the future. The statue that he commissioned of Dorothea Jordan in the years after his accession is perhaps the most revealing gesture he made toward the woman he had loved and left. It said something that he could not say in life, in the formal language of marble and public placement, that she had mattered, that he had not forgotten, that the 20 years of shared life were worth acknowledging in stone. Whether Elizabeth saw the statue, and what she felt if she did, is not recorded. As we reach the end of Elizabeth FitzClarence's story, it is worth pausing to consider what her life tells us about the world she inhabited, and what it tells us about the particular experience of being, as she was, a woman born between 2 worlds. She was not a queen. She was not an empress. She was not a figure who made great political decisions or commanded armies or left behind a body of writing that subsequent generations would study. She was, in the formal categories of historical significance, a relatively minor figure, a woman whose name appears in the footnotes of her father's biography, in the genealogical charts of her grandchildren's more famous marriages, in the occasional Victorian peerage and gazette, and yet her life, looked at steadily, contains something that rewards attention. She was born into a household that the world judged by the standards of legitimacy and found irregular, but that by the standards of human warmth and genuine affection was, in many ways, a better place than many formally constituted households of the era. She grew up knowing what it meant to be loved without quite being legitimate, to be acknowledged without quite being accepted, to belong to a world that held her at a slight but permanent distance because of the circumstances of her birth. She navigated that world with what the evidence consistently suggests was composure and dignity. She made a marriage that was good by the standards of her day, a marriage to a man of genuine standing, genuine ability, and genuine public achievement. She raised children who thrived. She maintained, through widowhood and aging and the dispersal of the generations she had grown up with, the human connections with siblings, with children, with the wider network of family that gave her life its texture. And she died making a journey for love, setting out in winter, in failing health, to be with a brother who was dying and never arriving, but having tried. The memento she kept, the stone and the gloves, speak of a woman who understood that love and pain are not opposites, that devotion can survive injury, that the complicated feelings we have toward the people who shaped us are not resolved by death, but persist in the form of objects carried through the years as evidence of what cannot quite be let go. Elizabeth FitzClarence was, in the end, a woman who lived fully within the world she was given, who made of its constraints and its opportunities something quiet and real and lasting. The world may not have given her a great stage on which to perform, as it had given her mother. It did not give her a throne, as it had given her father. It gave her instead the quieter dignities of ordinary human life, love and children and loss, and the long years of continuing after loss, and she inhabited those dignities with the steadiness of someone who understood what they were worth. The stone still exists, somewhere in the records of the House of Dun. The gloves were there too, and the portrait on the wall shows her face, the face of a woman born in royal shadow and married into ancient dignity, who kept faith with the people she loved and made the last journey she could make, and died one day before her 55th birthday in Edinburgh in January in the winter of 1856. And so we reach the end of our journey tonight, through the warm, crowded rooms of Bushy House, across the threshold of a wedding at Hanover Square, into the ancient dignity of the Scottish earldom of Erroll, and finally into the quiet winter of 1856, where Elizabeth FitzClarence made her last journey through Scotland and did not return. It has been, from beginning to end, a life lived in the spaces between the world's categories, between legitimate and illegitimate, between royal and commoner, between belonging fully and belonging at the edges. Elizabeth navigated those spaces with grace and with the quiet determination of someone who had decided, somewhere along the way, that the life she had been given was worth living well. Her great-grandson would marry a princess. Her distant descendant would be Prime Minister. The stone and the gloves remain as evidence that she loved her father. However complicated that love was, the portrait at the House of Dun remains as evidence that she was there, part of a family portrait of a family unlike any other England produced in the long, strange years of the Regency and the early Victorian age. May she rest in the peace she was owed, and may you, in the quiet of wherever you are listening to this, find the same. Thank you for spending this evening with us here at Sleepy Crown Reborn. If tonight's story found its way into your heart, a gentle like and a quiet comment before you drift off, perhaps telling us what part of Elizabeth's world stayed with you most, means more to us than we can say. And if there is a story you would like us to tell next, let us know. Sleep well. We will be here when you wake.